The 14th of May, 1942, and Edward Lewis Williams stood alone in the cavernous design hall of Newport News shipbuilding, staring at blueprints that every naval architect in America had called suicide. Outside, the James River flowed dark and cold, indifferent to the fact that the United States Navy had just lost the carrier USS Lexington to Japanese torpedoes in the Coral Sea, her crew abandoning ship as internal explosions tore through her fuel lines and magazine spaces. The loss haunted every shipbuilder on the eastern seaboard, but it obsessed Williams differently. He saw not tragedy, but a puzzle demanding an answer that conventional wisdom refused to provide. Williams had spent 23 years designing merchant vessels, crafting hulls that could weather North Atlantic storms and emerge intact. His colleagues respected his technical prowess but dismissed his latest obsession as the fantasy of a man who'd never understood warship design. The concept was deceptively simple, yet radically heretical. Instead of the Navy's standard practice of grouping all fuel tanks, aviation, gasoline storage, and ammunition magazines in centralized locations for efficient access, Williams proposed scattering them throughout the hull in smaller, isolated compartments surrounded by void spaces, empty tanks that could be flooded instantly to contain fires and prevent explosions from cascading through the ship. The Naval Bureau of Ships had rejected his proposal 4 times. Captain Harold Morrison, the Bureau's chief of carrier design, had called it an engineer's fever dream during their last contentious meeting in Washington. Morrison argued that Williams' design would reduce fuel capacity, complicate damage control procedures, and require crew members to traverse longer distances during combat operations, delays that could prove fatal when seconds mattered. The established doctrine held that speed of access trumped all other considerations. Carriers needed their aviation fuel close to the flight deck, their ammunition near the elevators, their operational efficiency maximized even at the cost of vulnerability. But Williams had studied the after-action reports from every carrier engagement since Pearl Harbor, with an intensity that bordered on monomania. The USS Yorktown had survived multiple bomb hits at Coral Sea, not because of her offensive capabilities, but because her damage control teams could isolate flooding and fires before they spread. The Lexington, conversely, had succumbed not to the initial torpedo strikes, but to fuel vapor explosions, hours later, internal wounds that metastasized beyond any crew's ability to contain them. According to records preserved at the Naval History and Heritage Command, gasoline vapor accumulation in poorly ventilated spaces had transformed the carrier into a floating bomb, killing the ship long after the Japanese aircraft had departed. Williams' hand trembled slightly as he traced the cross-section of his proposed design, what he privately called the cellular armor system. Each critical system existed in its own protective envelope, surrounded by spaces that could absorb shock, contain blast effects, and prevent sympathetic detonations. The cofferdams and void tanks formed an internal labyrinth that would confuse fire and explosion just as effectively as it might confound human navigation. It was biomimicry applied to naval architecture, the honeycomb structure of a beehive, each cell independent yet contributing to the whole's resilience. The telephone on his desk erupted into urgent ringing, shattering the evening's stillness. Williams lifted the receiver to hear Morrison's voice, stripped of its usual bureaucratic condescension and raw with something that sounded like desperation. The carrier USS Yorktown, barely patched after Coral Sea, had just been hit again at Midway and somehow, impossibly, she was still fighting. The conversation with Morrison lasted 17 minutes and transformed everything. The captain's voice carried across the telephone line from Washington with uncharacteristic urgency, each word precise despite the exhaustion evident in his tone. The Battle of Midway had erupted into the Pacific's largest carrier engagement, and Yorktown, despite taking to be AM hits and 2 torpedo strikes, had remained operational. For hours, through damage control measures that defied standard naval predictions, her crew had counter-flooded compartments, isolated fires, and maintained enough stability to continue flight operations even as Japanese bombs had penetrated her flight deck. Morrison needed Williams' cellular armor concept, and he needed it immediately. The Navy had authorized construction of 10 new Essex-class carriers, and the first Hull CV-9, rechristened USS Essex, was already taking shape at Newport News. Morrison proposed something unprecedented. Retrofitting Williams' compartmentalization system into Essex's partially completed hull. a modification that would delay her commissioning by 4 months but potentially save thousands of lives in future engagements. The catch was brutal in its simplicity. Williams had 6 weeks to prove his design wouldn't compromise the carrier's operational capabilities, or the project would be abandoned and his reputation destroyed. Williams worked through that night and 47 nights thereafter, sleeping in 4-hour intervals on a cot wheeled into the design hall. His team expanded to include Lieutenant Commander Robert Ashford, a damage control specialist who'd survived the sinking of USS Hornet and brought practical combat experience to theoretical discussions. Ashford initially approached Williams' designs with skepticism, pointing out that sailors fighting fires don't navigate with blueprints, they need intuitive paths through smoke-filled passageways, not mathematical labyrinths. The breakthrough came during their 14th consecutive night session, when Ashford described how Hornet's crew had fought desperately to reach firefighting equipment stored 3 compartments away from the worst blazes. Williams realized his cellular system didn't need to complicate damage control, it needed to distribute it. Instead of centralized firefighting stations, each cellular compartment would contain its own emergency equipment, foam generators, and flooding controls. Damage control teams wouldn't need to traverse the entire ship. They'd fight fires locally, containing them before they could spread to adjacent cells. The mathematics of survival became Williams' obsession. He calculated blast propagation rates through different materials, studied how aviation gasoline vapor dispersed in various ventilation configurations, and modeled the cumulative effect of multiple compartment floodings on ship stability. His desk disappeared beneath layers of engineering drawings, stress calculations, and damage projections. The night janitor, an elderly man named Thomas Wheaton, began leaving coffee and sandwiches beside Williams' drafting table, understanding without words that something historically significant was taking shape in that lamplit hall. By early July of 1942, Williams and Ashford had refined the design into something both revolutionary and implementable. The cellular armor system divided Essex's hull into 273 separate compartments, each one sealed and independently controlled. Fuel tanks were scattered throughout the hull in smaller units, never exceeding 4,000 gallons per compartment, and always surrounded by void spaces that could be flooded within 90 seconds. Aviation gasoline storage was divided among 16 separate tanks rather than the standard for massive reservoirs, making it virtually impossible for a single hit to compromise the entire fuel supply. The ammunition magazines received similar treatment. Instead of 2 enormous forward magazines vulnerable to catastrophic explosion, Williams distributed ordnance storage among 8 smaller magazines positioned throughout the hull's length. Each magazine was encased in protective cofferdams, empty spaces designed to absorb blast effects and prevent magazine explosions from propagating to adjacent compartments. The protective void spaces added 1,200 tons to Essex's displacement, reducing her theoretical top speed by half a knot, but Williams' calculations suggested she could absorb 4 times the damage of previous carrier designs. Morrison presented the finalized design to the Naval Board on the 12th of July, 1942. In a conference room overlooking the Potomac River where admirals and civilian engineers debated the proposal for 6 hours, the opposition came primarily from Admiral Kenneth Whitmore, whose son had died aboard Lexington and who believed carriers should prioritize offensive striking power over defensive survivability. Whitmore argued that Williams' design represented a defensive mentality unworthy of American naval tradition, that carriers should destroy enemy ships before they could launch attacks, making elaborate damage control systems unnecessary. The 13th of November 1943 dawned gray and cold over the Solomon Islands as the newly commissioned USS X steamed into her first major combat operation. Commander William Haverfield stood on the carrier's bridge, watching flight operations with the practiced eye of a veteran who'd served on 3 different flat tops before. Receiving this coveted assignment, Essex represented the Navy's newest carrier design, and Haverfield knew every admiral from Pearl Harbor to Washington was watching to see whether Williams' controversial compartmentalization system would prove itself or become an expensive liability. Below decks, Lieutenant Samuel Ortega supervised damage control stations distributed throughout the cellular compartments. Ortega had specifically requested transfer to Essex after studying Williams' designs at Damage Control School in Philadelphia. Recognizing that this ship required a fundamentally different approach to fighting casualties, instead of centralized teams rushing to trouble spots, Essex's damage control philosophy emphasized distributed response. Smaller teams positioned throughout the ship, each responsible for their assigned cellular zones. Ortega had drilled his crews relentlessly during the voyage from Norfolk, running through scenarios that previous carriers never contemplated. The Japanese air attack came at 1400 hours, a coordinated strike by 18 Aichi dive bombers and 12 Nakajima torpedo bombers, launched from the carrier Zuikaku. Essex's combat air patrol intercepted most of the attackers, but 3 dive bombers penetrated the defensive screen. Haverfield watched with professional detachment as the first bomber released its payload from 4,000 feet. A 500-pound bomb that struck Essex's flight deck 15 feet aft of the forward elevator, penetrating through to the gallery deck before detonating in what would have been a centralized fuel storage area on older carriers. The explosion killed 4 men instantly and ruptured fuel lines that began spraying aviation gasoline across the gallery deck. On a conventional carrier, this would have been catastrophic fuel vapor accumulating in enclosed spaces, secondary explosions propagating through interconnected compartments, the ship's entire fuel system potentially compromised.
Ow.
But Williams' cellular design transformed the geometry of disaster. The bomb had struck Compartment 7 Alpha, one of 16 separate fuel storage cells, each isolated by cofferdams and equipped with its own flooding system. Ortega reached Compartment 7 Alpha 90 seconds after the explosion, his team already deploying foam generators as aviation gasoline ignited in sheets of orange flame. The fire roared with savage intensity in the confined space, but it couldn't spread beyond 7 Alpha's boundaries. The surrounding void spaces contained no flammable materials, no fuel lines, no electrical systems, just empty tanks that Ortega's team began flooding immediately, using seawater to create a thermal barrier around the burning compartment. Within 4 minutes, foam had smothered the fire's intensity. Within 7 minutes, controlled flooding had cooled the bulkheads enough to prevent the blaze from conducting heat to adjacent spaces. On the bridge, Haverfield watched damage reports flow in with growing astonishment. Compartment 7 Alpha was effectively destroyed, her fuel tanks ruptured, her internal structure compromised, but the damage stopped there. The cellular isolation had worked exactly as Williams predicted. Essex had lost 4,000 gallons of aviation fuel and one of her 16 fuel storage cells, reducing her operational capacity by 6%. A conventional carrier would have faced cascading fires, fuel, vapor explosions, and potentially catastrophic damage. Essex continued flight operations 17 minutes after the initial hit. The second bomb struck 40 minutes later, penetrating the flight deck near the aft elevator and detonating in an ammunition. Handling space precisely the scenario that had destroyed multiple carriers through sympathetic magazine explosions. The blast killed 9 men and destroyed 6,000 pounds of ordnance. But Williams' distributed magazine design prevented catastrophe. The explosion was contained within Compartment 12 Charlie, one of 8 separate ammunition storage areas, surrounded by protective cofferdams that absorb the blast effects. Ortega's damage control teams flooded the surrounding void spaces, cooling the bulkheads and preventing the fire from reaching adjacent magazines. Admiral Raymond Spruance observed Essex's performance from the battleship New Jersey, 12 miles distant, recording in his personal log that the carrier had absorbed battle damage that would have crippled previous ships, yet continued launching and recovering aircraft throughout the engagement. The cellular compartmentalization system had transformed theoretical engineering into practical salvation, proving that Williams' impossible design could save ships and lives under actual combat conditions. The recovery efforts following Essex's first combat damage revealed both the genius and the complications of Williams' cellular design. Chief Petty Officer Margaret Rodriguez, one of the Navy's first female damage control instructors temporarily assigned to Essex for evaluation purposes, documented the challenges and reports that would later influence training protocols across the entire carrier fleet. Rodriguez observed that while the cellular compartments had successfully contained the bomb damage, repair crews struggled initially with the ship's complexity, what she termed navigational paralysis, in smoke-filled passageways where traditional landmarks no longer applied. The problem manifested most acutely during the 48 hours following the November engagement. Repair teams needed to access damaged compartments through unfamiliar routes, bypassing sealed cells and flooded cofferdams that transformed the ship's internal geography into a three-dimensional puzzle. Electricians mate First Class James Chen spent 11 hours rerouting power cables around Compartment 7 Alpha, discovering that the cellular isolation extended to electrical systems, a safety feature that prevented fires from following wire runs between compartments, but complicated repairs when multiple cells required simultaneous restoration. Williams received Rodriguez's detailed report on the 8th of December, 1943, while Essex underwent repairs at Pearl Harbor's Navy Yard. He read her observations with the mixture of pride and concern that characterized his entire relationship with the cellular armor system. Rodriguez's documentation confirmed that compartmentalization saved the ship. The engineering solution emerged through collaboration between Williams and Rodriguez during 3 intensive weeks at Pearl Harbor, marked with luminescent paint visible in smoke-filled darkness and supplemented by tactile guides that sailors could follow by touch when visibility approached zero. Each cellular compartment received color-coded identification corresponding to wall-mounted diagrams showing optimal paths to adjacent spaces. The modifications added another layer of complexity to Williams' already intricate design, but they transformed the cellular system from a theoretical marvel into a practically navigable environment. Essex returned to combat operations in February of 1944, participating in the strikes against Truk Atoll that destroyed Japanese naval power in the Central Pacific. The carrier's performance during these operations validated both Williams' original concept and Rodriguez's navigational improvements. When a Japanese bomber penetrated Essex's defenses and delivered a 500-pound bomb that struck near the island structure, damage control teams reached the affected compartments within 3 minutes, following the luminescent highways through smoke that reduced visibility to arm's length. The Truk engagement produced another critical revelation about cellular design benefits that Williams hadn't fully anticipated. The bomb that struck Essex's island structure caused extensive damage to radar and radio equipment, but the compartmentalized electrical systems meant that losing power in one section didn't cascade throughout the ship. Lieutenant Theodore Parsons, Essex's communications officer, managed to restore ship-to-air radio contact within 12 minutes by rerouting through undamaged cellular systems, a feat impossible on carriers with centralized electrical distribution, where a single major hit could compromise communications fleet-wide. By spring of 1944, 7 Essex-class carriers had entered service, all incorporating Williams' cellular armor system with Rodriguez's navigational improvements. The Navy's Bureau of Ships, once skeptical of Williams' radical departure from convention, now mandated compartmentalization standards for all new carrier construction. Captain Morrison, who had initially called the design a fever dream, published a technical assessment in the Naval Institute Proceedings, praising cellular armor as the single most significant advance in warship survivability since the adoption of watertight bulkheads. The human cost of innovation remained visible in Williams' private correspondence, preserved in letters he wrote to the families of sailors killed aboard Essex during her first combat engagement. To Mrs. Sarah Whitmore, whose son Daniel died in the initial bomb explosion in Compartment 7 Alpha, Williams wrote on the 23rd of December, 1943, "Your son's sacrifice helped prove that this ship's design could save hundreds of other lives." The compartment where Daniel served contained the blast that would have killed dozens more on conventional carriers. This provides no comfort to your loss, but I wanted you to know his death mattered beyond measure. The letters revealed Williams' burden. His cellular design saved ships and lives in aggregate. Couldn't protect the individual sailors who happened to be in the wrong compartment when bombs struck. Each casualty report that crossed his desk carried names, ages, HOMETOWENS, human particulars that statistical success couldn't absolve. The 19th of March, 1945, brought USS Franklin Essex's sister ship and the embodiment of Williams' cellular armor concept within 50 miles of the Japanese homeland for strikes against airfields around Kobe. Commander Leslie Jers commanded Franklin with aggressive confidence, pushing his carrier closer to enemy territory than cautious admirals recommended. At 700 hours, as the carrier prepared to launch her first strike wave, a single Japanese Yokosuka bomber penetrated cloud cover at 8,000 feet, approaching from the northwest where Franklin's radar coverage was weakest. The bomber's pilot, Flight Petty Officer Shizu Watanabe, released 2 semi-armor-piercing bombs from 3,000 feet before. Franklin's anti-aircraft batteries could track him effectively. Both bombs struck the carrier's flight deck crowded with fully fueled and armed aircraft preparing for launch. The first bomb penetrated the flight deck and detonated among aircraft on the hangar deck, igniting aviation gasoline and triggering sympathetic explosions in armed torpedo bombers. The second bomb struck near the aft elevator, penetrating 3 decks before exploding in a compartment containing high-octane aviation fuel. What followed tested Williams' cellular design beyond any scenario his calculations had contemplated, their combined ordnance detonating in a cascade of blast effects that would have destroyed any conventional carrier instantly. Franklin's crew faced conditions exceeding even the catastrophic fires that consumed the Lexington in 1942. Aviation, gasoline rivers flowed across tilted decks, ammunition cooked off in staccato bursts, and the ship developed a 30-degree list as firefighting water accumulated on the port side. Yet, Franklin didn't die. The cellular compartmentalization that Williams had designed in that lamplit Norfolk hull prevented the catastrophic progression of damage that had doomed previous carriers. Compartment boundaries contained individual fires, preventing them from merging into a single, unstoppable conflagration. The distributed fuel storage meant that, although multiple cells were compromised, the ship retained aviation fuel in undamaged compartments. The separated magazine spaces prevented a single massive explosion that would have obliterated the vessel. Lieutenant Commander Joseph O'Callaghan, Franklin's Catholic chaplain, moved through the burning compartments organizing firefighting teams and rescue operations with remarkable courage that would later earn him the Medal of Honor. O'Callaghan understood intuitively what Williams had designed mathematically, that Franklin's survival depended on fighting multiple localized battles, rather than attempting to control a single overwhelming disaster. He directed damage control teams to seal compromised compartments and abandon them temporarily, focusing resources on preventing fire spread rather than extinguishing every blaze simultaneously. The cellular design's effectiveness became evident through comparative analysis that naval architects conducted months later. Franklin absorbed damage equivalent to what had sunk or crippled every American carrier. Lost in previous engagements, she'd suffered more bomb hits than Lexington at Coral Sea, more fire damage than Yorktown at Midway, more casualties than Hornet at Santa Cruz. Yet she remained afloat through the cellular isolation of catastrophic damage. The distributed systems meant that losing 30% of her compartments still left 70% operational, whereas conventional carriers became mission kills when critical centralized systems failed. The human cost was devastating. 724 men killed, another 265 wounded in explosions and fires that raged for 5 hours. Franklin's casualty list represented the second highest death toll of any surviving American warship, a grim statistic that haunted everyone who'd advocated for cellular armor. Williams received the preliminary casualty reports on the 22nd of March while working in Newport News, and the numbers struck him with physical force, each name representing someone who trusted that his design would protect them. Captain Jers managed to restore enough propulsion to get Franklin underway at 3 knots, steering toward the open Pacific, while Japanese aircraft continued attacking the crippled carrier. The cellular compartmentalization that had contained the initial explosions now provided progressive damage resistance. Each subsequent hit compromised isolated sections rather than cascading through the entire vessel. Franklin absorbed 2 more bomb near misses and extensive strafing damage during her agonizing withdrawal, yet maintained enough stability and buoyancy to eventually reach Pearl Harbor under her own power. The voyage home took Franklin 12,000 miles at speeds varying between 3 and 14 knots. Her crew working continuously to shore up damaged compartments and restore disabled systems. The cellular design's distributed nature meant that repair efforts could proceed simultaneously throughout the ship, teams working in undamaged compartments didn't need to wait for fire suppression in distant sections. This parallel restoration capability, unplanned in Williams' original concept, proved crucial to Franklin's survival during the weeks-long journey to safety. The 5th of April, 1945, found Edward Williams standing on Pearl Harbor's Pier 11 as USS Franklin limped into port, trailing damage visible from miles away. Her flight deck was warped and blackened. Her island structure bore scars from explosions and fires, and temporary patches covered dozens of hull penetrations. Yet she floated on an even keel, her engineering spaces functional, her compartmented structure having absorbed punishment that would have sent conventional carriers to the bottom. Williams had flown from Norfolk specifically to witness Franklin's arrival, driven by complex emotions he couldn't fully articulate even to himself. The carrier's survival validated every controversial decision he'd made. The scattered fuel tanks that prevented a single catastrophic explosion, the isolated magazines that contained ordnance detonations, the distributed systems that maintained critical functions when centralized equipment failed, Yet standing on that pier, Williams couldn't celebrate purely technological triumph while 724 sailors' families mourned loved ones who'd burned or drowned in compartments he'd designed. Engineering success measured in saved ships felt hollow when measured against individual human losses. Commander Gares descended Franklin's brow, looking decades older than his 43 years. His uniform stained with smoke and salt water, his face bearing the haunted expression of someone who'd witnessed hell and survived through luck and determination in unknown proportions. Williams introduced himself awkwardly, uncertain what words could bridge the gulf between theoretical design and practical catastrophe. Gares studied him for several seconds before speaking. "Your compartment saved my ship. 700 men are alive because fires couldn't spread the way they would have on a conventional carrier. But I need you to understand what it was like inside those compartments when they were burning." What followed was a 3-hour conversation in Franklin's burned-out wardroom. Gares describing in precise detail how the cellular design had performed under conditions beyond Williams' worst projections. The isolated compartments had indeed contained fires and prevented cascading explosions, but they'd also trapped men in sealed spaces when rapid flooding became necessary. Sailors in Compartment 8 Delta had pounded on sealed hatches as seawater poured in to contain fires, their voices audible to damage control teams who couldn't open the doors without compromising the entire ship's survival. Gares himself had given orders sealing compartments with men still inside, making calculated decisions about acceptable losses to save the larger vessel. Williams listened without defending his design or explaining his calculations, recognizing that Gares needed to share the moral burden of survival that came with commanding a ship built on compartmentalized sacrifice. The cellular armor system worked precisely as Williams had intended, isolating damage, preventing catastrophic failures, saving the ship, but it imposed impossible choices on commanders, forced to decide which compartments to save and which to abandon. The mathematics of survival proved more complex than engineering equations could capture. The Navy's formal assessment of Franklin's survival came through official channels over subsequent weeks. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, commissioned a detailed analysis by naval architects and damage control specialists examining every aspect of the carrier's performance. The report, classified, secret and spanning 217 pages, concluded that no conventional carrier design would have survived Franklin's damage, that Williams' cellular compartmentalization had prevented certain loss of the vessel and saved approximately 1,500 lives that would have been lost in a catastrophic sinking. The assessment noted specific instances where cellular design features proved crucial. Isolated fuel tanks that prevented the ship's entire aviation gasoline supply from detonating. Distributed electrical systems that maintained emergency lighting and communications when primary systems failed. Separated magazine spaces that contained ammunition explosions. The report calculated that Franklin's cellular structure had absorbed blast effects equivalent to 3 times her displacement, an explosive force energy that would have torn a conventional hull apart through progressive structural failure. Yet the document's appendix contained troubling observations about human factors Williams' original designs hadn't fully considered. Several sailors had died of smoke inhalation in sealed compartments, where ventilation systems, correctly designed to prevent fire spread, had also prevented breathable air circulation. Others had drowned in spaces flooded too rapidly for evacuation, victims of automated systems designed for speed over human reaction times. The cellular armor system, optimized for ship survival, sometimes conflicted with individual survival in specific compartments. A tension inherent in any design, prioritizing collective safety over personal escape routes. Williams spent May and June of 1945 working with Rodriguez and a team of damage control specialists to refine cellular design protocols based on Franklin's brutal lessons. They developed emergency breathing apparatus, positioned in every potentially isolated compartment. Installed manual override systems for automated flooding controls. And created emergency egress hatches that allowed trapped personnel to escape even from sealed spaces. These modifications added complexity and weight to the cellular system, but they addressed the moral dimensions of compartmentalization that pure engineering had initially overlooked. The modifications spread throughout the Essex-class fleet as each carrier rotated through maintenance periods, transforming Williams' original concept into something more humane, without sacrificing its protective capabilities. The 15th of August, 1945, brought news of Japan's surrender, ending the Pacific War that had driven Williams' obsessive pursuit of carrier survivability. The final tally showed that Essex-class carrier Zoll, incorporating cellular armor systems, had absorbed more combat damage than any previous carrier class while suffering no losses to enemy action. The statistics told stories of survival. USS Bunker Hill absorbed 2 kamikaze hits that killed 396 men but remained afloat. USS Intrepid survived 4 separate kamikaze attacks across multiple operations. USS Hancock absorbed bomb damage that would have crippled earlier carriers yet continued flight operations. Williams compiled these outcomes in a personal journal, not for publication, but as private reckoning with his design's real-world performance. 24 Essex-class carriers had entered service during the war, participating in every major Pacific engagement from 1943 onward. They'd collectively absorbed 167 bomb hits, 54 kamikaze strikes, and 31 torpedo impacts, while losing only individual compartments rather than entire ships. The cellular compartmentalization had proven its worth measured in vessels saved and sailors returned home. Yet Williams couldn't ignore the costs embedded in those survival statistics. Across all Essex-class carriers, 2,187 sailors had died in compartments that successfully contained damaged men trapped in isolated cells while the larger ships survived their sacrifice. Each death represented the cellular design working as intended, prioritizing collective survival over individual escape possibilities. Williams maintained correspondence with families of sailors killed in sealed compartments, explaining without justifying why their loved ones had died while ships lived. The post-war period brought recognition Williams had never pursued. The Navy awarded him the Distinguished Public Service Award in September of 1945, citing his contributions to carrier survivability. Professional engineering societies invited him to lecture about cellular armor design. Requests he generally declined, uncomfortable with celebrating innovations born from so much death. Captain Morrison, now promoted to Rear Admiral, nominated Williams for inclusion in the Naval Academy's curriculum as example of engineering innovation under wartime pressure. The true legacy of Williams' cellular design emerged not through awards or recognition, but through its influence on naval architecture for decades following the war. The principle of compartmentalized isolation spread beyond carrier design to submarines, battleships, and eventually merchant vessels. Williams' insight that distributed systems provided greater survivability and centralized efficiency became foundational doctrine in naval construction worldwide. Soviet designers studying American carriers after the war adopted cellular concepts in their own vessels. British naval architects incorporated compartmentalization principles into their post-war fleet designs. By 1950, Williams had returned to designing merchant vessels, applying cellular concepts to commercial shipping where fire containment and cargo isolation offered similar survival benefits without the immediate mortal stakes of combat. He worked quietly at Newport News until his retirement in 1963, avoiding publicity and declining most requests for interviews about his wartime contributions. His colleagues respected his reticence, understanding that Williams carried complex feelings about innovations that saved thousands while sacrificing hundreds. The cellular armor system's ultimate vindication came in January of 1969 when USS Enterprise, a nuclear-powered carrier incorporating advanced versions of Williams' compartmentalization concepts, survived catastrophic fires following an explosion in her bomb assembly area. 27 men died in the initial blast and fires, but Enterprise's cellular structure contained damage that would have destroyed earlier carriers. The incident demonstrated that Williams' 1942 insights remained relevant to carriers built 30 years later, principles that transcended specific technologies or propulsion systems. Williams died on the 23rd of November, 1974. At age 79, his passing noted briefly in Norfolk newspapers as the death of a prominent naval architect. The obituaries mentioned his wartime contributions without fully conveying how fundamentally his cellular armor concept had transformed carrier design. His personal papers, donated to the Naval History and Heritage Command, contained thousands of pages of calculations, damage reports, and correspondence with sailors and families' documentation of both technical triumph and moral complexity. The preservation of Williams' documentation allows contemporary naval architects to understand not just the engineering principles behind cellular compartmentalization, but the human context in which those principles emerged. Its designs represented more than abstract calculations. They embodied specific responses to specific tragedies, its attempts to prevent future Lexingtons and Hornet losses through radical reimagining of how ships could absorb and contain damage. The cellular armor concept Williams pioneered in 1942 continues influencing naval design into the 21st century. Though modern engineers rarely recognize the obsessive Newport News shipbuilder who originated the principle, contemporary aircraft carriers from multiple nations incorporate compartmentalized systems, descended directly from Williams' original blueprints. Distributed fuel storage, isolated magazine spaces, redundant electrical networks that maintain function when individual sections fail. The fundamental insight that ships survive through isolation rather than concentration has become so embedded in naval architecture that it no longer requires citation or acknowledgement. Captain Sarah Chen, commanding officer of USS Gerald Ford, commissioned in 2017, walks compartments designed using principles Williams established 75 years earlier, though she's never heard his name. Ford's cellular structure can isolate any of her 308 compartments within 90 seconds. Containing fires and floods through automated systems, Williams couldn't have imagined but implementing concepts he originated. When Chen conducts damage control drills, training her crew to fight localized battles rather than ship-wide conflagrations, she's perpetuating Williams' doctrine without knowing its origin. The historical amnesia surrounding Williams' contributions reflects how thoroughly his innovations became standard practice. Revolutionary concepts that challenged every conventional wisdom in 1942 are now fundamental requirements in naval construction specifications worldwide. Williams' name appears in specialized technical histories and naval architecture journals, but the cellular armor system itself has achieved that peculiar immortality of ideas so successful they become invisible infrastructure rather than innovation, assumed rather than attributed. Recent scholarship has attempted to recover Williams' story from the broader narrative of carrier development. Dr. Michael Torres published Cellular Salvation, the untold story of USS Essex's survival systems in 2021, examining Williams' original blueprints and correlating them with damage reports from every Essex-class carrier engagement. Torres' research documented how cellular compartmentalization prevented losses that standard prediction models suggested were inevitable. Statistically, the Essex class should have lost 3 to 5 carriers to battle damage based on hit rates and explosive yields, yet all 24 survived the war. Torres interviewed surviving Franklin crew members, men now in their late 90s, remembered fighting fires in isolated compartments while knowing that adjacent spaces contained trapped shipmates they couldn't reach. Their testimony provided human texture to engineering abstracts, describing what cellular isolation meant in practice when fire roared through sealed spaces and seawater flooded at rates calculated for ship survival rather than personnel evacuation. Several veterans expressed gratitude that compartmentalization saved the ship, while acknowledging nightmares about sealed hatches and voices calling from spaces they couldn't open. The moral complexity. Williams grappled with designs that saved ships by sometimes sacrificing sailors in isolated compartments remains relevant to contemporary naval architects facing similar trade-offs with modern technologies. Automated damage control systems can seal compartments faster than humans can evacuate them, prioritizing collective survival over individual escape possibilities. The cellular principle continues requiring commanders to make calculated decisions about acceptable losses to save larger vessels, burden Williams understood intimately and never fully reconciled. Contemporary naval engineers studying Williams' original designs at the Naval History and Heritage Command discover not just technical innovations, but philosophical approaches to survivability that transcend specific technologies. Williams' insight that distributed systems provide resilience through redundancy applies equally to computer networks, electrical grids, and supply chains, any complex system vulnerable to cascading failures. The cellular concept he developed for carrier protection has influenced infrastructure design far beyond naval applications. The Franklin remains Williams' most complex legacy as ship that validated his design through unprecedented survival, yet accumulated casualties that still haunt surviving crew members 8 decades later. The carrier absorbed damage exceeding any vessel in naval history while remaining afloat, proof that cellular compartmentalization worked as Williams predicted. Yet her casualty list testified to the human costs embedded in any system prioritizing collective survival, reminding engineers that technical success involves moral dimensions equations alone cannot capture. Williams' personal correspondence, preserved in archives he never expected anyone to read, reveals a man who understood both his design's triumph and its burden.
Right.
In a letter to his wife Martha, written in December of 1945, he reflected, "The ship survived, and I'm grateful for that. Thousands of sailors came home because compartments contained fires and explosions. But I cannot stop thinking about the men who died in those same compartments, isolated by the very systems that saved their ships. This is the bargain I made, and I will carry it forever." The cellular armor system Edward Williams designed in that Newport News drafting hall transformed carrier warfare and saved countless lives through innovations that became fundamental to naval architecture worldwide. His legacy persists in every modern warship's compartmentalized structure, every damage control protocol emphasizing distributed response, every design philosophy recognizing that survival emerges from isolation and redundancy rather than centralized efficiency. Williams gave the Navy a way to keep burning carriers alive, and the cost of that gift included knowledge that sometimes survival requires sacrifice in spaces he created. The impossible hull design proved possible, and ships still sail on principles one obsessive engineer refused to abandon when conventional wisdom called them suicide.